Hi, my name is Minda Hartz, and you are at After Six with the Memo. Happy Thursday. If you are watching us live, hello. You see all these beautiful brown faces in a Brady Bunch type situation. And if you are listening in on the line, we welcome you. We know that you might be traveling, and so we're going to make this a really great conversation. Welcome. If you've never been to any of our events at the Memo, then you're in for a treat. If you've been here before, then you already know how we get down. We talk about those things that happen after six. We have the real adult conversations, and tonight we are here to talk about intersectionality at work. And it's so important if we move the needle on equality that we talk about intersectionality. You can't talk about diversity and inclusion without it, in my opinion. But you'll hear from these women tonight as they dive deep, and take notes and follow us on Twitter, my weekly memo and hashtag intersectionality. And I'll be capturing the gems that these women, I'm sorry, drop. And so without further ado, we want you to be engaged. So if you're watching us live, make sure that you type in the questions or chat function, whatever you have access to. And so we'll be doing a Q&A at the end. So we'll make sure you get your questions answered. And then also too, we can't see you. I know some people are always worried about that. So you're good if you're in your pajamas or having a glass of wine. It is all good. So welcome, and you're in for a treat. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Taylor Ray, who's going to moderate this lively conversation.
Hey everyone, let me just make sure. Yep, everybody can hear me. Okay, so my name is Taylor Ray. I'm the CEO of V3 Inbound. It's a marketing company, and I am so happy to be with the Memo and hosting this tonight. But let me pass it on to our, panel. Make sure everybody gets their intros in. So we'll start with Tiffany.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Tate, and I've spent the last 10 years or so working in higher ed, mostly in an undergraduate student facing role. And the last 5 years or so, I've been a champion for career and professional development for early career professionals. So, in my 9 to 5, that's me. And outside of work, I spend a lot of time doing strengths coaching and professional development consulting and just helping women and other folks just dive in and engage in professional spaces.
Hey everybody, Hey there, my name is Tyler Young, and I am managing editor for The Plug Daily. And The Plug is a daily tech newsletter geared toward Black technologists. So pretty much I curate content just to let you know what's happening in tech ecosystems across the country. For the majority of my career, I've worked in television. So for the first 5 years after college, I worked as a news producer in Charlotte, and then I decided I wanted to kind of take on more freelance projects. So now I'm working on writing my own television scripts and things of that nature. So I'm just a all around creative girl, but for the most part, I'm all about putting Black folks on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lakeisha Steele. I am a legislative assistant on Capitol Hill, and I work on a host of issues, but my primary issue is education policy. My path to the Hill is very unique in that I came from the private sector and spent 9 years working for law firms, performing risk management, and decided to make my way to Capitol Hill into public service in 2014, and have been lucky to work in education policy and as a legislative assistant as a Black woman, where I work to make sure that marginalized communities are centered in public policy and that our voices are at the table. Glad to be here.
Okay, thank you, ladies. So we're gonna hop right in with question number one. So what does intersectionality mean to you? This time we're gonna start with Lakeisha.
This is such a great question. I think intersectionality means understanding the full human experience of marginalized communities. And in policymaking, you can't center marginalized communities of color in policy without centering their experience and uplifting those voices at the table. So that is my biggest takeaway on what I believe intersectionality means.
To me personally, intersectionality means all of me, my wholeness. And so, especially in the workplace, that means I have two targets on my back. I'm Black and I'm a woman. And so, with that being said, half of me has to keep in tune with my Blackness and the issues with discrimination and just all types of unconscious bias. And then the other side of me, I'm a feminist, and I have to let people know, yes, I am a woman. Yes, I'm in tune with women's issues, but you have to also treat me equally because of the color of my skin. So I'm looking at the broad scope of things when I'm thinking of intersectionality.
I would just echo what both of these ladies have already said. I think that, intersectionality is critical for any professional space. I show up as a woman, I show up as a Black woman first. I show up as a mom now. I champion for folks who look a lot younger than they are, because I think age is part of it too when you're talking about professional growth and sponsorship and all of those good things. And really, it's every piece of identity or experience or perspective that you bring to the table. And it might be a bit biased of me to say this, but I think they're really all the bits that make a vanilla world a lot more colorful. And it's not possible for me to talk about things like the wage gap as a woman, which is usually, the tone of the conversation, and not include the fact that for different demographics, the wage gap conversation looks really different, right? So for me, intersectionality is critical for talking about issues like that impact large communities and the success of our communities.
That's definitely a really good point. So what would you say companies can do to promote intersectionality in their workplace? And we'll go with Tyler this time.
I think the best way for companies to promote intersectionality is to listen. Just to listen, allow us to lift our voices, allow us to come to you. I think, and for me personally, as a young woman, when I first entered into the news industry, I never felt as though I had an equal say in a lot of the issues that were happening in the world. Because as you know, for any company, there's certain levels in your structure, and so I was always afraid, well, they're going to think I'm rookie or I'm just the dumb Black girl. I think that for especially people who are in leadership positions, have an open door policy. And when you say an open door policy, let me know that it is okay for me to come inside and let you know my issues and not have any type of repercussions. So definitely having a voice and an equal say in the workplace for me.
I think that a lot of organizations, especially corporations, are really good about creating things like resource groups. So safe spaces for folks who identify, whether that's race and ethnicity or their sexuality or anything in between, creating sort of affinity groups where folks can get together and talk about challenges that they might have in the workplace. So I think that's one way, is creating safe spaces. But I also echo what Tyler said. Folks need to be represented. They need to be able to activate their voice. And I would go a step further and say that decision makers need to represent the population that an organization serves. So as a woman who has unfortunately often been the only Black or brown person on a team for the last 4 years, really most of my career, I find that it's great to check the box and say, oh, great, Tiffany's here. We're representing this whole faction of people. But for me, I've really grown when I've had folks lift me up and invite me to meetings where maybe my position wouldn't necessarily be the person that you would ask, but they wanted a different perspective that'll speak to the whole group of people who aren't there, right? And so I think companies have to build leadership. Folks need to see folks above them so they can not only see that they can aspire to those roles, that they actually have access to those roles. So for me, I think companies need to create safe spaces, but they also need to make sure that their decision-making groups and boards represent like a diaspora of people.
I certainly would echo everything that Tiffany and Tyler mentioned here. But to add on to that, I think hiring, you have to hire women of color to lead these organizations. And specifically, on Capitol Hill, when you're talking about our policymakers, that means representation. Representation is one of our most valuable democratic values. And so we need member offices on Capitol Hill to represent the states that they are from. So, to just take a deep dive just for a second, as a Black woman, I'm from Illinois. I'm from a low-income background. I'm a first-generation college graduate. So when I look at specifically the House just marked up in December a Higher Education Act. So specifically, when I look at, the Higher Education Act, when you think about, Tiffany brought up earlier, the wage inequity, Black women make 66 cents on the dollar. Black women also have the most advanced degrees. So that means Black women have a great deal of student loan debt. Women represent 51% of breadwinners. So what does student loan debt look like for women of color? And then also, what does that look like, when you're low income, when you're trying to gain access and opportunity to higher education? In terms of policy making, are there unintended consequences that are going to create additional barriers that we know exist in systems, and our systematic barriers of inequity exist because of how our country was founded? So does the policy actually dismantle those barriers? Are you providing those resources to improve access and opportunity in higher education? But specifically in the K through 12 level, are you paying attention to what's happening to students of color? And that students of color are more than likely to go to high poverty schools that are under-resourced. So what does this policy mean for improving and dismantling that inequity is there to make sure students of color succeed? And as a woman of color, and when you hire women of color, those are things that we pay attention to when it comes to policy making. So hire and then trust them to lead.
Can I add one more thing? Oh, can you hear? Okay. So the other thing I would add on top of that is train everyone else. So when you hire women of color, they're not coming in and doing all of the work that other folks around them should also be sharing. Because I think going back to this idea of tokenism, it's great to hire folks and have them there, but I shouldn't be doing 3 jobs because we're not doing diversity and equity training across the board for everyone else at the organization. So I think that's sort of the next step, right? Like having a bunch of folks represented, putting them in those leadership roles, but then training everyone else so that they're not feeling the burn of working with folks who don't get it. And training people who might be managing diverse teams around bias in terms of performance management. I mean, intersectionality is about who we represent and who we are, but it also means that the folks that we work with should know what that means. I had a conversation with someone the other day who had never heard of the term, and she's almost twice my age. And so it was a great conversation, and we've built enough of a relationship where we could talk about it. But I'm thinking, wow, like we work with students, we work with young people, and you don't know what that means. And yet our student population is almost 30% students of color or students from other countries. And you don't know what that means. How can you advise them in a career capacity?
And, I'm sorry, Taylor, can I just add to what Tiffany is saying? I think, until we get there, because we know that training doesn't always occur. And in many places, it doesn't always exist. So I think being as a woman of color and being comfortable bringing your full self into every space that you occupy, it's going to require you to be the voice and to have those conversations with your colleagues and to understand that comfort has nothing to do with it. So, until your company gets there, right? Until our country gets there and understanding that we are becoming a more perfect union. But until we get there, I do think that it requires us to lead the way and to understand that at many times that places an additional burden, and stress and pressure on us to be that voice at times.
Okay, so just piggyback off of everything, this has been such an amazing conversation. But just to piggyback off of what you guys were saying about hiring and training and leadership, so would you say you know of any companies who really exemplify having integrated intersectionality into their, workplace environment, their company culture? And we'll go with Tiffany this time.
I mean, I think I get the great opportunity of seeing a lot of organizations that are trying to hire interns. And I think a lot of organizations have pipeline programs where they're hiring at internship level students who are not white. And so those are big banks, right? Like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, organizations like that that understand the bottom line benefit of having diverse professionals on their teams. But I also think of companies like Google. I know Alicia Butterfield Jones is the head of the Black community there, and companies like that who are prioritizing equity and inclusion and putting a label on it, putting a name on it, making it very public. And so I think there are other organizations who could take examples from that. But I just think of companies like in the financial sector. Technology is a big one where DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion is a hot topic because they know they're failing. So um, those are kind of the types of organizations I think of.
I think there are companies are kind of slow right now to move the needle. I know right now in tech, diversity is a huge buzzword, but then when it comes down to releasing the diversity report, they'll say, "Oh, we hired a couple of more women, and we have a couple more women in leadership staff, but no, we didn't hire that many Black people this year, but we'll try again next year." So it is neat that there are more talent pipeline programs, and it's neat that there's more internships and grant opportunities. But the biggest issue that I think with bringing a lot of companies, why they're so slow to bring intersectionality to the workplace is because there's this longstanding idea of, well, we've always done it this way. If it's not broke, let's not fix it. I've always had, it's been a white boys club. We've been profitable this way. And again, as Lakeisha was saying, if Black women, are the fastest growing number of entrepreneurs, pay us, show us, represent us. It's that simple, you know?
I'm actually coming off the hills of an event. So on Capitol Hill, there's a such thing as caucuses, and a caucus is representative of an issue that you want to bring awareness to and develop policy around. And this week, the STEAM, which stands for Science, Technology, Education, I'm sure Tyler knows, and arts. And mathematics, and it integrates arts into STEM. And we had this joint event, the HBC. It was an HBCU event that's led by Congresswoman Alma Adams, and she's one of the co-chairs of the HBCU caucus. And we joined together in this STEAM Day of action, and it brought together the tech industry, HBCU leaders, and policymakers to have this conversation around diversity and inclusion in the workforce, in the tech space, and making sure that HBCUs are involved in diversifying that pipeline of talent. And it was wonderful to see. Lyft actually was one of the partners in the event, and they actually took the HBCU challenge. And the HBCU challenge is them committing to supporting HBCUs, and then also looking at these graduates in their applicant pools when they're hiring. HBCUs produce 40% of African American engineers. We know that we wouldn't have a Black middle class without our historically Black colleges and universities. So it was a timely conversation. It was very much needed. But I think that when you have congressional leaders paying attention, to these issues, to then elevate an issue to national consciousness, so that we can understand, first of all, like you all mentioned here, what does diversity inclusion actually mean? And if we're going to push our companies to make sure that they understand what that means. What does that implementation then also look like? And then as policymakers, what can policymakers do to help them get there? So I think companies like Intel, Google partnered with Howard for Howard West to create new curriculum for the students, but then also to take it a step further, because just because those students now have access to that education, do they have access to those opportunities? So creating this partnership so that those students then get to go to Google, they get to learn, they get to do these internships, so then they now are even that much more competitive. And so it's really great to see Lyft, Google, and Facebook, all these companies, one, creating public policy spaces where they're hiring women of color to lead, that are also coming together to have these conversations, to then partner and work with industry to figure out, well, what does that progress look like? And then also where you're lacking, what is the support that you need? Because there are some companies that want that want to actually diversify. And I mean, Congress, for example. So when you talk about creating a diverse applicant pool, well, the people that are in charge of hiring decisions, well, where are you going to look for that talent? Are you going to the Senate Black Legislative Staff Caucus? Are you going to Congressional Black Associates? Do those applicants have access to those opportunities? So making sure you're casting your net as wide as possible to capture that talent to be able to compete for those opportunities. And so I think it was a great conversation to see those industry leaders and HBCU leaders come together to have that productive conversation.
Okay, so continuing on to what you said about what does diversity and inclusion actually mean? It seems like a lot of companies are kind of solely focused on the diversity part and aren't really paying as much attention to inclusion. So, why is inclusion so, integral to diversity? And we'll go with Tyler.
So I gotta say, and I believe Minda, she tweeted this a couple of weeks ago. There was a panel, there was a tech panel, and it was, I believe, it was majority white guys and maybe two white women, and they were discussing diversity. How can you discuss diversity and you not have one single person of color? I am so sick. I am so sick of seeing that. And then also you'll see companies, they'll say, our company is committed to diversity and inclusion, and this is that, and this and that, and then they'll have one Asian on the team, or they'll have, two white guys from two different backgrounds. And so with that being said, you have to have execution in place. If you're gonna talk the talk, if you're gonna say all this, then actually back it up. I know the other day there was a group of tech CEOs and founders. They all said, we don't want your VC money if your company, if your firm is not diverse, flat out. So if we start to call people on their bull, just flat out let them know that you're not living up to your standard and you're not treating us well, keep your money.
I think that there are a lot of reasons. I know some organizations go the what's the good for business route when they're talking about inclusion and why it matters for the bottom line of an organization. I personally think it's a moral imperative when you think about the history of our country and who built it. It floors me that in 2018 I can still be the one. It's just, I think it's problematic for a lot of reasons. But it's great to invite a bunch of people to the party. It's not great if those people aren't part of a community. And that impacts engagement. It impacts promotion. It impacts street credibility for your organization, right? Like if I have worked in an organization and you've siphoned my intellectual capital, and I leave and I can't say, hey, this was a great place to work, this was a great place to be, then you're not going to have other people worth their salt joining an organization. And I can say that with confidence. So diversity, I think, was a big buzzword maybe 10 years ago. I remember my school was one of the first PWI institutions to have a chief diversity officer, and so that was a big thing sweeping the nation for educational spaces. Now organizations and companies have chief diversity officers, and diversity is a in a lot of ways a comfortable word for people, but inclusion requires action, and a lot of times really unpopular action. So for organizations that are doing it right, it means that you are inviting folks to the table. You have diverse applicant pools. I think one of the women already mentioned, and you have equitable searches, equitable sort of training and development plans for everyone. And you're promoting and sponsoring those people to either move up in your organization or move out and move up somewhere else. The same way that you would for a white man or a white woman, that same access and support should be there for everyone else. And until we get there, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done. And Lakeisha, I appreciated what you said about it is a burden for us. I'm saying that because I'm a little tired coming off the heels of being. I found out today in my department, I've literally been the only person of color the entire history of the organization, and I didn't know that. Just in my, not at the whole organization, but in my department, and it's wild to me that could even be a possibility when you look at what the student population looks like. So in a space where we're supposed to be creating safe spaces and helping students get to their next level, why wouldn't there be adequate representation at the staff and faculty level, right? So if you go out into other organizations, and I can only speak from an educational perspective because that's been the arc of my career, I don't understand why an organization would not want to invest in inclusion and promoting inclusive practices, because at this point, you can't afford not to.
I think, when it comes to diversity, when you can say and promote, I'm a diverse organization, I'm a diverse office, that makes you feel really good, right? Because diversity, improves organizational behavior. It improves your work product. It improves your bottom line, because you have representation there to represent multiple constituencies, multiple voices, demographics, multiple, clients, the marketplace. But when it comes to inclusion, it's where you take a step further. Tiffany actually, really touched on this. I once heard, I think it was Bakari Sellers that tweeted out that diversity is being invited to the ball and inclusion is being asked to dance. So, as a Black woman, when you're being asked to dance, are they listening, to you? And so, from the space, in which, I am, and right now, in terms of policy making, so in my office, anytime, there is a statement that's put out, anytime there's a resolution, anytime that there is legislation, especially when it comes to education. Education laws were born out of the civil rights movement. These were civil rights laws. The Elementary Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act, these are civil rights pieces of legislation. Our country made a commitment to equity and opportunity in education. It's why I get to sit here, largely because of Shirley Chisholm, who said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. But Black women shouldn't have to bring a folding chair, because you should care about that inclusion. And so to understand, also to take it a step further, there's a consequence when that inclusion, that inclusivity is not there, because that means that you have a blind spot. So whether you are talking about something, an issue that I've worked on that's really close to my heart is gun violence. Gun violence coming from a state like Chicago. So as a Black woman coming from that space, if we're talking about, gun violence, then we also have to talk about massive disinvestment in the communities, which means under-resourced schools, which then also means that these are high poverty environments. So which means that we have to take it even further to talk about concentrated poverty, concentrated segregation that was rooted in historical racist housing policies, which still have its effects today. So going back to my original, point is that inclusivity is making that commitment to dismantle those barriers that we know that are still there. And when you have women of color at the helm of leadership and paying attention. And I agree with you, Tiffany, it should not always take a person of color. It doesn't mean that we're more comfortable having these conversations because we exist at every single point of that intersectionality, whether we're talking about race and gender and class. But, because we know that it's an area our country is still becoming, a more multiracial, more understanding, more compassionate, more inclusive, diverse. We already have the diversity, but that inclusivity. So I think until we get there, I think we have to be willing to walk through that fear, to walk through being uncomfortable and having conversations with our colleagues and our organizations. And so, and knowing which levers to pull to be able to have those conversations, because if you're the only one that is still there in that environment, well, what are you doing in your space of power to then pull up others behind you? Because otherwise then you're kind of useless. So what are you doing to use your voice to make sure that we are heard? And then what are you doing to pull up more women of color behind you? And that's when you're fully activating inclusion, I believe, in organizations.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left for this part. So I'm going to squeeze in this last question and then you ladies can run through it. So it's kind of shifting a little bit. So how does intersectionality relate to identity and justice? I know identity and justice are very, big right now. So if you guys can touch on that briefly, we'll go with Tiffany this time.
I think when I think about identity and I think about justice, I go back to, I think Tyler said, we should be able to show up in every space and bring our whole selves. I know, like in the early days growing up, I know my mom and my granny, taught me, well, you got to button it up. When you go to school or you go to work, you have to show up this way. And we all know we have a phone voice. My husband makes fun of me because I naturally have a phone voice. Whatever. I was a Navy kid, but I should be able to show up in a meeting, and if something is a problem, say, hey, this is a problem, and not be worried about how that comes out, what that looks like. Not to say that we shouldn't be professionals, right? But I think identity and justice means I don't have to do mental gymnastics and drain myself thinking about how to present it, because that wastes time and energy to get to the work. So in terms of identity and justice, I think it's a social justice issue in terms of access to resources. We've already talked about inclusion and what that means in every sphere of our existence in this country. But at a very baseline level, it just means that we can show up. It means that we can be ourselves at work, at school, with our families, and our peers, our colleagues, our children, whoever can do the same thing because they're seeing us do that. So that's what it means to me.
I know a lot of times for Black children growing up, your parents always have that talk with you. You have to work twice as hard to get half as much. And a lot of times when we're growing up, we're taught, going back to the phone voice, and we're taught to, don't make a fool of yourself in front of mixed company. Make sure you don't show out. And my question is, why in 2018 do we still have to conform to other cultures? Why do we have to act and look a certain way? Even when I was preparing for this webinar, I was like, oh my God, how should I wear my hair? How did my hair look in the, how did my hair look in the photo? And I'm like, wait a minute, I can be myself. I can be me. And we have to have these conversations and foster these safe spaces. And so a lot of it, growing up, I was usually the only Black child in class. And to add on another layer to it, my parents just had to name me Tyler. And with that being said, there were so many other white boys in my class. And so it was just so many, it was always difficult for me to kind of find my space. And so now that I'm able to be in the company of bright Black women such as yourself, work for a Black publication, I feel more empowered now to have conversations about race, about identity, about class, about the wealth gap. And so I say all that to say that going back to having these conversations, we shouldn't just have to have these conversations after 6. We need to have it at 9, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, all day long until they get it.
This is such a great question because it really reminds me of Oprah, Mother, Queen Mother Oprah. Always, she loves Maya Angelou. And one of the things she always says from her poem for my grandmothers is that I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. So every day before I walk into the office, that is something that I repeat to myself because there are very few Americans that get the experience of interning on Capitol Hill, let alone working on Capitol Hill. So the fact that I have been able and blessed to change careers and to be working as a legislative staffer, on Capitol Hill, it means I'm standing on the shoulders of my ancestors, standing on the shoulders of everyone that has come before me. So that means I have a responsibility and a duty to not ever, ever, ever shirk my responsibilities and the connection between my identity and commitment to justice. We are still, look at, when we talk about, police brutality and the young man Stephen Cook, who was just killed in his backyard. That means we are still living with the intergenerational effects of slavery. We are still living with the intergenerational effects of Jim Crow. We are still living with the intergenerational effects of not being seen as fully human. So what am I doing to make a deeper commitment to equity and opportunity? I am not a mother yet. I hope to be someday, but it's not just about when I have children. Right now, working in education policy, it's about every single child in America. What am I doing to make sure that that equity lens is there? Again, going back to dismantling these barriers, because we all had to walk through them. And if it wasn't for our leaders who stood tall, who stood brave, the John Lewises, who's an icon, a living legend, civil rights icon for us, and came within an inch of his life on that Edmund Pettus Bridge. So what am I doing right now in this space to make sure that 50 plus years later of being, and honestly, of African Americans having full citizenship, and we can also argue that we don't yet have full citizenship when our skin is an act of aggression in and of itself. So I think that it is having that full understanding of what does it mean, to make sure that you are honoring, our history, our ancestors, and everyone that has come before us in the spaces that we're in, and to further the work. So I think it's really making that commitment to make sure that the next generation is better. And it shouldn't mean just taking care of your own kids and your own household and your own friends and your own circles. It is about community building. It is about nation building. So I think understanding that requires a great deal of us to understand, to make sure that our identities are forever ingrained in our history and grounded in that truth, so that is fully resonated in every single thing that we do. It was John Peel that recently said, our truths are the best weapon to the lies in this world. So fully honoring that and being comfortable and recognizing that your voice matters, but this work matters. So showing up every day in that space and honoring all those who have come before us.
Wow. This has been such a great conversation. I've just been sitting back in awe of all of you, breaking it down like a perm, just straight up, just lacing it. And I love every bit of it. A couple of things. We've had some questions come in, and if you haven't asked your question, go ahead right now and pop it in the questions feature and or the chat box, whatever you're able to do. If you're listening in by phone, we feel bad for you because we know you want to be able to ask questions too. But tweet these women. Their hashtags are on our Twitter page. So if there's questions that we didn't get a chance to answer for you, I'm sure that they will be available to respond to you. But I definitely, I know how it is to sometimes be the moderator, but I'd love to ask Taylor Ray, what is your definition of intersectionality? Did I put you on the spot?
Yeah. When I think of like the working definition, it's I feel like everyone's already said it. It's, if I were a puzzle, intersectionality is like the cover on the box. Like when you see what the puzzle looks like when it's all together. So it's like a lot of people ask like, oh, are you Black or are you a woman first? And it's like, I'm both at all times, always. There's never a moment where I can say this thing happened just because I'm Black and not because I'm also a woman, or not because, you know, my family are, you know, immigrants and things like that. There's always these things interacting at the very same time. So it's like intersectionality to me is like the complete picture of all of a person's identities come together.
That's definitely a good way to put it. I think I love the puzzle piece, the version. That's a good analogy of that. I know that you guys. Well, one thing that Keisha said was, you know, it was our ancestors. You know, it's our responsibility to fight this fight. And I heard someone once say that if you find a good fight, jump in. And I think that intersectionality is one of those good fights. Like, we're not going to be able to move forward without having the fight and having the conversation about it. When you guys are feeling stressed and Tiffany, you said emotional gymnastics. When you guys are feeling that way, who are your role models, your leaders that you gain strength from to make it through and keep pushing?
That's a hard question because that has continued to evolve for me over time. But I have a small group of folks that I consider a mentor council. So depending on what I'm dealing with, I'll call the best person for the job, sometimes two people for the job, to get varied perspective. So that if I'm dealing with a situation at work or in another professional context, I can get multiple perspectives as I kind of plan my attack, so to speak. I mean, that's probably not the best choice of words, but as I plan how to kind of move through a difficult situation or a challenge that I'm having, whether that's politically in the workspace, or if I'm trying to come up or bounce ideas off of someone and I want someone that's disconnected from the situation to talk to, I usually reach out to one of my mentors. I also have a lot of what I call mentors in my head. I think the power of social media is really awesome. Like Minda, I haven't had the opportunity to meet you in person, but I think about folks like you or Angelina Darisaw, who I finally did meet in person, but folks that I first connected with online, and I see them as really great people who are doing this thing called life, and they're doing it very gracefully and navigating really tough situations, and just seeking ideas from them based on what they're posting online through their blogs or videos and things like that, just to give me added perspective so I can see beyond my vantage point.
I am a proponent for internet friends. I am all about loving on Black women all day long on the internet. I believe, Minda, that's how I found you. I'm like, hey girl, I like what you're doing. Can I interview you? Flat out, you know. So just retweeting and just getting energy from you all day long. And right here, as you can see, I don't know if you can see in the background. Listen, I have my Bible. I will stop what I am doing. You're not going to stress me out. And really, I want to be honest about this, is that we only have one life to live. And we spend so much time stressing out, trying to please this person, trying to meet this deadline. And then I don't want to look up one day, and whenever I'm thinking on my legacy and thinking of how I spent my time, I don't want to look back and say, all I did was work. And it's so sad when we look back at our parents, our grandparents, their parents, all they did was work, and truly, for lack of a better word, slave. flat out. So where I truly derive a lot of my strength, like you said, mentors in your head. Me and Oprah have a conversation all day. I'm going on with her, quotes from her, and I watch a lot. I listen to positive affirmations during the day. But as far as deriving my strength, I want to just really quickly. I derive my strength from my late grandmother. She lived to be 97 years old, and for 40 years she was blind. My grandmother lost her sight whenever she was in, I believe she was in her 50s. And so a lot of times whenever I'm feeling lost and I'm feeling as though there's really no light in my pathway, I tell myself that your grandmother lived in darkness for 40 years and she didn't complain, not one time. And God saw her through all of that. That is my strength. And you know what? I kind of suck it up and I say, you know what? I'm on this journey for her. So that's where I get my strength.
And to build on it and to really echo that, Tyler, I think that is just representative of Black women. We are we come from just a line of strong and brilliant and resilient and powerful women. My own mother was born in 1948 in the Jim Crow South. And so I think about if my mom could be a single mother and raise 9 kids, then I certainly can show up, and do this work with the understanding of knowing that she had to overcome so much to get to where she is. But also the other thing I think that's particularly important in this work as a Black woman is falling into yourself, practicing self-care. I know it's something that we talk a lot about, but it hasn't been something that I'm good at actually practicing. So it's something that I am learning to do better at. But also the other thing is just checking in on my sisters, like Tyler said, like loving on Black women. I would not obviously be here without my girl Minda. We met in undergrad, but checking in on each other, falling into each other. I think that there is nothing like that sister connection. There's nothing like that love that we have for each other that has the ability to empower, affirm each other, but also to check you when you need it. And to make you take a step back and, like, okay, I'm out of line here, or I need to do here, or I need to step up my game here, or I need to make sure that I am taking care of myself, in this situation. And also finding mentors. If you don't have one in your work environment, create them, look for them, look for the Minda Harts, the Tyler Youngs, the Tiffany Waddells, and the Taylor Rays, of the world. Nothing like the internet and, a good Instagram, a good Twitter. Like Tracy Ellis Ross really is someone I believe is my friend in my head.
I would definitely say, yeah, as everyone said, like, especially like with Twitter, which is like my favorite social media ever. It's just like gives me so much access to so many amazing women who are just like inspiring and like literally they're just living their own lives. I'm just like, wow, look at what you are doing. And like, I try to like to live up to that like standard. And they're all these Black women. And then like just one person I would say who's my best friend in my head is, Beyonce. And just the fact that like looking at the way that she like intentionally protects her peace, like we have not seen her do an interview since like 2005 or something like that. Like she was just like, look, I let you know when you get access to me. And like looking at that, I'm like, that's just something so revolutionary to do as a Black woman, to say like I control who gets access to me, because we know historically, that just has not been a thing. And that's something I took from her. And I'm just like, I'm closing off myself, in whenever I need to. And it's just amazing to me. And it's like, I don't know her. I'll probably never meet her, but I'm like that's the thing that I take with me, is like, that kind of builds me up inside, to know that this is something that I can do, that anybody can do, that you don't have to be Beyonce to protect your peace. And that's just amazing.
Amen to all of it. I love it. We got some good questions coming in too, and I want to make sure we get to those. So here's a good one. So sometimes okay, we'll start here. This has been such an insightful conversation. Sometimes I feel like the only one in a lot of places. I am LGBT and a woman of color. Have you found that some of your additional identities, religion, political affiliations, motherhood, etc., have been a barrier?
I would say, see, that's the thing. I feel like I don't have that many other identities that are like that you would say, like are LGBT or like non-Christian or non-heterosexual, non-cisgender, the things that, do definitely impact, the places that people can go and the access that they get. So it is a bit hard to answer that question other than the fact that, like, as I think I said earlier, my family did move to the United States from the Caribbean. So it's like there was that additional barrier of like, okay, you have to prove yourself because you weren't just born here. You don't just have what everybody else has. Like, you came here. So there's something to prove as a person who moved to this country. And I don't know if it's a barrier, but I don't know if it's a barrier on the outside as much as it's a mental barrier to say that I put additional pressure on myself because of that, to say, kind of like you said, like, you're standing and 10,000 people are standing with you. There is like other identities where it's like, it's not only, Black people standing with me, it's West Indian people, it's women, it's all these other identities. So it's not even like 10,000 people standing with you. Sometimes it feels like, 100,000 or a million, depending on, how many identities intersect for you. So I can definitely see how, barriers in place, internal and external, would kind of hold you back or put additional pressure on you.
I really do think that this question is our reality. There is a terrible loneliness that comes with being both. I can as a Black woman, low income first generation student, former college graduate. And then you compound that. So this is a woman of color who is also LGBT and LGBTQ. And so, that's an additional, because of the society that we're living, if we're having honest conversations, that does mean that there is an additional burden that is placed on her culturally, and communities, but then also your work environment, and then also walking through this world, walking, through our country as a Black woman that's both LGBTQ, and then you intersect that with class, then that's even compounded additional burdens and oppression. So then understanding, well, what is in your space, there are people that have roles and oppression and power over women, Black women, LGBTQ women. So with that additional burden, it does come with the increased, I think, empowerment from conversations like this, to not only live your truth, but to understand that we see you, we hear you, you matter above anything. You matter because you were born, but to also understand that you're not alone in experiencing that loneliness when it comes to intersectionality, which is why, Minda, this conversation is so timely and is so important, so that we're having these conversations so that we know that, hey, like, we even though, yes, there's loneliness in it, but it doesn't have to be. Coming together and having these conversations and creating these spaces where we can share our truth and empower each other, and affirm each other to go forward, but also to do this work and understand, in doing this work, there's also no additional burden that comes with that. So understanding what that means, that we need to be that much more supportive, of intersectionality, and understand what it means when it comes to race, class, gender, income, religion, and what that means when we show up, in the spaces that we occupy, and that we see each other and affirm each other, and supportive, of each other.
Does anybody else have anything they want to say about that, or we good?
I
Okay.
think,
No, oh, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, I think it depends on sort of where you are, because there are pieces of, like, in the early days of becoming a mom, on one hand, it helped me build relationships with people that I might not have otherwise because they were also parents. But in the early days, I had a lot of fear and anxiety about people thinking I was going to step back from my career, because a lot of my identity has been work up until this point, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That's just been my world. And I had folks I worked with who thankfully, in my presence, or maybe to a person who is willing to tell me, say things like, oh, Tiffany might not want to pick up that project, she might not want to do that, or that's going to take her away from home, or, and I was thankfully able to step up and say pretty quickly, hey, I'd appreciate if you asked me before you assumed, because depending on what it is, it might actually be something I want to do. I don't want you to assume because I have an infant at home that I'm not down for the cause. Like, I still want to get this work done. And I do like to travel. So, let's talk about it. If I can plan in advance, like, don't assume. And so there have been times where things like that have been barriers for me, or potential barriers. But then there are times where it's also been a value add or an asset, in terms of a privilege I didn't have before, because there are people that I might not have been able to, I know a lot of times in business, people talk about men playing golf or basketball on the weekends. Well, in a place that is predominantly run by women, a lot of the fun offline stuff is centered around families. And before I was a mom, I wasn't invited to play dates or things in the park and stuff like that, where a lot of sort of close relationships or alliances or sort of familiarity was built. And so while that wasn't my intention to bring those relationships into work, it has helped me work outside of my department. And those are spaces I probably wouldn't have been in without being a mom. So I think it depends on where you are and what's going on around you in the context.
That's great. No, I think one of those things too, as part of intersectionality, is that we own some of the privilege that we step into the room with, so some of the barriers that other people don't have that we have, and vice versa. And with that, being conscious, and being an ally or a success partner, whatever you want to use, what terminology you want to use, but we need to be there and for everyone, rather it's those with disabilities, those trans women, we all have the work to do together, and it's all hands on deck. I can't do it without them. They can't do it without me. Whatever box you identify or check the box on, we're in this together as women. That's the fundamental starting point, and then it starts to layer as we go down. And I think the more we have these conversations, the more that we are supportive and not feeling like we don't have a voice. Like you said, Tyler, not just after 6. We need to be talking about this at 8 a.m., at noon, all around the clock. And so that's important. I know I'm so sad that we're almost at the end, but quickly, let's go around, let them know how they can find you so that they can become Twitter boos or friends with you guys and keep track of you. So how can they find you?
You guys can find me on Twitter at Tiffany I. Waddell, I think. My name's confusing because I have a different last name. But my Twitter handle is Tiffany I. Waddell, and on Instagram, it's Tiffany Waddell Tate, and I'm following the memo, so you can find me there.
My name on Twitter and Instagram, both at She Is Tyler, and then I have a blog, it's girltyler.com. It's just funny stuff, so enjoy.
Follow her on Instagram. I always get my life, your Instagram stories. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna actually now I'm actually follow her on Instagram now with this recommendation. But if you guys want to find me, I spend most of my time on Twitter. It's simply TC, so just like Simply Lemonade, but it's simply TC. And yeah, that's where I am.
You can find me on Twitter at Woman of Steel. I have a really great last name, Onai. You can also find me on Facebook under Lakeisha Steele, where I love to chat about all things policy, and where I'm just talking about rooting for everybody Black.
And she really means it when she says it. So that's that's another after 6 conversation. But I definitely want to thank you, ladies, for being with us, for dropping those gems. My fingers couldn't move fast enough. I needed Drake's Twitter fingers to help me. I just wasn't moving fast enough, so forgive me. For those who took the time to connect with us tonight, listening in, watching, thank you so much for your time. We will continue to have these conversations, continue to support each other. We see you. Even though we can't see you physically, we're there with you. Connect with us on Twitter. You don't have to go through this alone. And if you're in New York City, next week on the 28th, we're launching the Alliance. So we're taking 12 women and building alliances, helping you stay accountable, holding you accountable for what you say you want. That starts next week. So go to our website and sign up. There's a few spots left. We have a secret location with dinner and beverages, and we're going to just finish out this year strong together. So if you feel alone and you don't have that network, sign up at myweeklymemo.com. And you guys have a great week. All right. Stay Black, stay brown, stay whatever you identify. All right. Bye-bye.